Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Nikki Hill.
And me, Tom Parkin, and my head is reeling a bit, Nikki. I'm watching all these things go on. Canada's headed towards a Trump-imposed deadline on Kuzma. Mark Carney is saying ingratiating things about this attack on Iran being worth it and a game changer. Got a G7 meeting where Trump told the media and the other six beside him that I'm the boss, and keeps pushing for critical mineral access, and he's talking about trying to maintain U.S. control of AI. There's just so much of a feeling for me right now, like everybody's under this guy's thumb. And can we get out from under it? Is there a path towards a country that, where we feel like economically strong and secure and not under this guy's rule? So we have a great guest here today to help us think about restoring real economic progress for people, getting incomes ahead of prices for a change.
Yeah, we do. It's great. And I think it's one of the first people we wanted to be on the show when we started back in January. And he's a busy person. So we're happy to get Jim Stanford, who's an economist and is a director at the Center for Future Work here in Vancouver, was a longtime chief economist and policy director for Unifor, the union. And he has some really great insights and analysis on some of the challenges that we're facing as a country and as a world right now. And that's not the end of our great upcoming interviews. Just because we're heading into summer doesn't mean these people are not joining us on the show. So we have interviews coming up with Merritt Stiles. We have Carla Beck in the next couple of weeks. And then we also have Jared Walker, who's executive director at Canadians for Tax Fairness. So whatever podcast player you're listening on, make sure you're tapping that follow so you're getting alerts when our new episodes come out each week. But first, we're going to have Jim Stanford coming up after we do This Week Below the Fold, talking a couple of important news stories that didn't make national headlines.
Nikki, BC had a lot of activity with the Prime Minister in town last week and the World Cup games, but also including that incredible 6-goal victory. Like, everybody went bananas about it. That was fantastic. But anyway,
apparently,
you also had, had to talk about that. But also some big announcements around housing and infrastructure. But you in BC, but you also wanted to touch on some of how this same politic plays or not doesn't play, I guess, in Nova Scotia.
We had Nova Scotia NDP leader Claudia Chender on the show a couple of months ago, and she was talking specifically about some of the money that the Houston government's leaving on the table from the federal government. We were talking about pharmacare in particular, the impact that's having on affordability issues for Nova Scotians, as they can see at the same time provinces like BC, Manitoba are leveraging those dollars for popular healthcare needs that, of course, are keeping money in people's pockets, like contraception, diabetes medication, menopause treatments, and more. I think BC also was able to come out this week on some of their planning around hearing devices. So I think, things that people have to go out of pocket to pay for, using the dollars that you can get from the feds. So she's also raised similar concerns recently that the Houston government is again failing to access the funds the federal government's put on the table for provinces, like the $366 million through the Build Canada Strong Fund, which could actually be used for housing, which I think, across the country, important. Post-secondary education, capital infrastructure, also important. And then the Canada Public Transit Fund, which has funds for over 10 years for public transit infrastructure. So it's one of those things, I think, again, where we're seeing some governments lean into these partnerships and some lean pretty far out, which, as we see these affordability crises continue across the country, is probably impacting them somewhat in public opinion polling as well. I think we're seeing that more and more. We did see Quebec and Ontario jump on their deals, though, with Ottawa pretty early. Ontario was back in March. That was a $3.8 billion deal, which gave them the first partnership with the federal government on the Build Community Strong Fund. And then, of course, that sets some benchmarks for other provinces to work from, including BC. So BC, as you said, lots of activity here last week. The Prime Minister was in town for the big announcement with Premier Eby on their version of this partnership on June 18th. That was a federal investment of more than $5 billion over 10 years for BC's local infrastructure. They also did some meetings after, so obviously lots to talk about between the Prime Minister and Premier Eby when we're looking at things like Alberta's MOU and the path forward for BC on similar partnerships there. But then, of course, as we said, we had the World Cup game here, and lots of time for politicians to attend that and dig into the celebrations, because that's been taking over Vancouver as well as other cities. But on that deal, so where the BC agreement leaned into, because these are different agreements based on jurisdictional needs, was a reduction in municipal development charges on multi-unit housing of up to 50% for 3 years. So those are some big fundings there per unit through Build Communities Strong. But also something that's getting a lot of chatter is a new partnership between the two levels of government on a condo conversion. So using Build Canada Homes financing to turn some of the vacant condo units into affordable homes. So, details pending on how they plan to do that. And then 2.5 billion much needed here on infrastructure projects. There's a number of projects that are in high demand and agreed to between province, municipalities, federal government, including here the Surrey to Langley SkyTrain extension. And
Mm-hmm.
then money from both for healthcare infrastructure, of course, really needed, community infrastructure. And then I think importantly, to remember that we had the tragedy in Tumbler Ridge in February. So both this
Yes.
agreement included $100 million from each level of government to get the Tumbler Ridge people a new secondary school and then
Mm-hmm.
a modernized healthcare center. So starting right away on construction. So, we are seeing this provincial flavor to each of these agreements. So in that vein, Claudia Chender back in the Nova Scotia NDP leader frame, calling on Premier Houston to help Nova Scotians with some of the affordability issues that they're facing by getting deals underway. So specifically looking at programs keeping affordable apartments, expanding rapid transit and ferry service, focusing in on the needs around the Halifax regional municipality as well, where there's opportunities, and also looking at where some of these funding opportunities could address issues that they're seeing be exacerbated in Halifax in particular. So we're seeing there, no matter the fact that there is a housing plan in place, homelessness really rising in the Halifax region in the past few years, even since the government has brought in a housing plan. So again, how do you get some of these other tools in the toolbox to be applied to help
Mm-hmm.
out people when they need it most, but also planning. So, the Nova Scotia government's response to all of this is that their 5-year housing plan, which I think is that 3 years ago into it, is starting to have an impact. But housing experts in the province are also saying that it's actually high-end rentals coming
Yes.
online where there's a high vacancy rate or a low vacancy rate for lower cost apartments, which is, again, how you should be using all the tools in the toolbox. And I think not an uncommon trend we're seeing, but if that's your housing plan and you're not going to go dig into where other opportunities lay, you can see where the public's going to have some concern and also push into the affordable and public housing needs there. I think, it's worth noting, because we've talked about it recently as well, is Houston is one of the premiers finding himself down in the polls, and
Mm-hmm.
latest premier standing, which is Angus Reid Institute, to give them some credit. And then also we had James Valkey on the show from Viewpoints Research, who recently shared data from a poll they did that showed that 60% of Nova Scotians think Houston and the PCs are on the wrong track. So I think, as you start to see these trends and our province not engaging and getting that investment from the federal government continues to be a theme for you, you also then lean into that narrative of not acting for Nova Scotians at a time when people feel these pressures.
Yeah, it's kind of odd, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of people in your part of the country, my part of the country, think, oh well, housing prices are going down. We're still having the condo crash and all this kind of stuff. That's not what's going on in Halifax. House prices and rents are at new highs,
Yeah.
and they're just in a different market space. And I can't. It just kind of strikes me as very strange that given that context, and given the fallen support in the polls, that like, why is Tim Houston not trying to figure out some policy levers that he can get Mr. Carney to help him with
Hmm.
to address the major electoral problem that he's facing
Yeah.
in a market crisis that's building? What do you think, Nikki? just seems odd to me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're going to, continue to see the narrative run. It gives a great space for an opposition leader to
Yes,
call
great for
question
her.
into.
Yeah.
So, and who knows, maybe there's secret deals and negotiations going on behind the scenes. Certainly in BC, the housing minister
Yeah.
and the premier have been really upfront that they were in these negotiations with the federal government. So
Yeah.
one would think if you were actually trying to bring the investments into the province that you'd be saying that too.
Crowing
Um,
about it a bit anyway, right?
Little bit, yeah. Their jurisdictions are showing you can before it's
Yeah.
signed. Tom, we saw some data out late last week about quickly growing grocery and gas retail sales margins that seem to have slipped well below the fold, but you're covering it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So on Thursday, a release of updated info from Statistics Canada gave a pretty clear indication that the food and fuel price inflation we're feeling is being considerably driven by a rapid increase in sales margins. What, in other words, what some economists call seller's inflation.
Hmm.
So StatCan does this retail service price index every month. It measures the difference between the prices retailers pay to wholesalers and the prices they charge to you and me at the store. So that's the sales margin. And the data showed that since 2020, January 2020, the sales margin index for all retailers, not just food, for just generally in retail, was up about 22% in that period, which is not far off the general mark of inflation, which kind of makes sense because that's where
Hmm.
that's where we get inflation at the store. But in the same period, the sales margin for gas retailers went up 43%, twice as fast, while the margins on grocery stores rose 56%,
Oh.
or 2.5 times faster than the general inflation rate. So this data isn't just below the fold. I think it went completely
Hmm.
unreported by any major media
Hmm.
outlet. But if you do want to read up on it, I have my Substack data shows have a write up on it there. You can Google it, and it's got some pretty charts as well. So this data, like, just to be clear, this data doesn't mean there aren't also increases in wholesale prices that are driving food or fuel inflation. Obviously,
Hmm.
there's war, there's crop problems from time to time, all these things. We're going to talk to Jim Stanford about that in a bit. But what the data definitely does show is that grocery and food retailers are jacking up their take from the price that you pay, rising more than twice as fast as in other retail sectors. Now,
Hmm.
of course, gas and grocery retailers have to pay wages, they have to pay rents, all the stuff that it takes to run a business, and that's what that margin is supposed to be for. But
Hmm.
I don't think anybody working at a grocery store got a 45 or
No.
55% wage increase, and commercial rents are not going up that fast either. So there's a lot that is, in a world where your sales margin is going up very quickly and your costs are not going up as quickly, that's called gravy. And Loblaw's company is, of course, the 52% owned by George Weston Limited.
Hmm.
Loblaws being, of course, one of the biggest grocers in this country. They released their first quarter financials early May, and let's just say, Nikki, the Weston family is holding up pretty well in these tough times. A
Yeah.
lot better than
I don't tend
yeah, a
to
lot
worry
better.
about the Weston family.
No, I think they're going to make it. They're going to make it. On May 6th, they released their financial statements for Q1 2026, reporting revenues of 14.5 billion, 14.5 billion for 3 months, up 580 million from the same quarter of 2025. The earnings of the company were 594 million, up
Mhm.
91 million. And I know that sounds like a jumble, but here's the key number: up 18%
Yeah.
from the same quarter of last year. And their financial statement reported that the quarterly common share dividend increased 10%. So they got a 10% dividend hike. And they said that's the 15th consecutive year of dividend increases. Now, I know you and me and Doug, our producer, are doing this podcast thing because a long time ago we talked about it. And as traditional media fades, the right wing is creating its own disinformation sites and labor and social democrats. We felt that we needed to create a space to have our own discussions. And here's the thing that we also have in common with the Westons Nikki, just like you and me and Doug, who are digging into our own pockets to put up this little media enterprise, so are the Westons, with all that money that we are giving to them in those expanded margins. Last November, right around the time we were digging in for, I don't know, paying for software or something like that, a new website was registered called bgiant.ca. I'd never heard of it, but it launched this winter with a kind of slick website. But, the part I really loved is like Jack in the Box. Boom, 14 employees on the first day. And quite the slick website. A lot of the most recent articles contain commentary from CEOs offering their thoughts on how to make Canada great again. Much of it gleaned from a joint Royal Bank of Canada Eurasia Group event earlier this month. Eurasia Group is a geopolitical risk consultancy where Gerald Butts, John Baird, Dominic Barton work. And so did Prime Minister Carney's wife, Diane Fox Carney, worked there until recently. Anyway, the contact information on the B Giant website registration that's covering all this kind of CEO news gives an email address back to Whittington Investments Company. That's the family holding company that owns that 52% share of Loblaw. So, Nikki, it is nice to know that Galen Weston is also digging into his pocket to fill the void as traditional media fails and fades. But, of course, unlike the three of us, his pockets are being well filled by the fast rising grocery store margins that are driving inflation, hurting people, damaging our economy. And, I guess for all that, he gets to call himself a philanthropist and a patriot. But I think kind of what this whole episode shows is that once again, the old proverb is true. Freedom of the press is for those who own one. So everybody, go get your press. All right, let's take a quick break.
Anyone can do it.
Anybody can do it in the digital era. Yeah, just that the Westons can do it a lot faster.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be back with Jim Stanford.
Jim, welcome to Left, East to West. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to get you on. Folks will know you from your frequent economic commentary, but they may not know that after you completed your PhD in economics, you're also political director for about 20 years at Unifor. And then for about a decade after that, you were the director of the Australian Centre for Future Work, but came back to Canada doing a separate Centre for Future Work here in Vancouver since 2020.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was the economist at the Canadian Auto Workers and then Unifor. And then I left in 2016 to join the think tank world where I've been working since.
That's great. I'm glad you are. Okay,
Somebody's
so
gotta
let's
do
dig
it.
into it. Yeah, someone needs to do our thinking. Okay, we're going to dig into it and pull some of those things out of your brain. So recently you've been talking, as many of us have been, about the Iran war and the price of oil that is not a lot of space being taken up here in the Canadian public debate, even though there's, rising pressures for the public. So the price of gas is up a lot, even though most of our oil is domestically supplied, and what we import is not supplied from places affected by the war. But when the public's filling up their tanks, it's costing, upwards of $30 more. Where's that $30 going? And how damaging is this fuel inflation? Can we prevent it?
Well, you don't need a PhD in economics to figure out where the money's going. It's going to the oil companies. They are, most of the oil that we consume in Canada is produced in Canada. And the price of producing it, the cost of producing it hasn't changed since Donald Trump started this war. So the fact that your gas tank is $30 more to fill than it used to be means, for the most part, $30 profit for the oil industry. Their costs are the same and their revenue has jumped. And this kind of raises a fundamental question that I'm sure many Canadians asked. They saw the price of gas jump by several cents a liter within hours of Donald Trump starting the war. And knowing full well the gas had been in the reservoir under the gas station for days or weeks. So what gives? And even allowing for the time lags and so on, the oil that we consume didn't come from the Persian Gulf. So why are we paying that much? It will have a negative impact on Canada's economy at a moment when we don't need more bad news. We need good news. The economy is kind of slowed to a halt in the year since Donald Trump's tariffs came into effect. we should be having lower interest rates to help the economy through this, but instead we'll probably get higher interest rates to try and control the inflation resulting from this price spike. And in the meantime, we estimated in our research about $50 billion of extra consumer costs,
Oh, wow.
both direct for the gasoline and diesel and fuel oil, but more importantly, indirect through higher prices for all the other things
Right.
that use petroleum products in their production. That is actually a bigger hit ultimately to consumers than just the gas price. And that's going to take real purchasing power out of Canadians' household budgets at a time that they can't afford it. So it's bad news all around. It's likely to get worse despite the so-called peace deal that Trump has signed. And it's utterly unnecessary. It's unnecessary immediately because, of course, Trump didn't have to start this war. It accomplished absolutely nothing. But also unnecessary because Canada is a huge net exporter of energy. We produce way more than we use, and there's no need for us to have to ride the same roller coaster as the world oil price.
Yeah.
And Jim, you've talked a little bit about the idea of trying to really take some of that windfall profit that the oil companies are making and reinvest it in the Canadian economy. So just explore that for a second.
Yeah, we estimate that revenue to the upstream industry alone, that's the part of the oil industry that extracts oil and gas and ships it around, will probably grow by between $65 and $100 billion this year. Because of those $30 extra that Nikki paid for her gas and millions of other Canadians paid for their gas. And the oil industry always benefits from a shock like this. The oil industry set records, all-time records for its profits in 2022. That's when we had the last oil price shock after Russia invaded Ukraine.
Right.
Yes.
Fun fact, Ukraine doesn't produce oil. So that whole price shock, in a way, was almost imaginary. It was driven by the speculative excesses of oil futures markets, not by a real supply shock. But nevertheless, oil prices shot up to over $100 US a barrel, and that was the biggest single cause of the inflation that we grappled with in Canada. Inflation hit 8% 4 months after that invasion. Now, there were other things going on, of course, the reopening after the pandemic and so on, but the inflation was primarily caused by that oil price shock. So we're going to see actually new records set for oil profits this year, breaking those 2022 records. And, there's various ways to try and address this inequity. Canadians are suffering and paying extra, and the oil industry is making record profits. That is unnecessary, and it's clearly unfair. One way would be to have an excess profits tax. So, various forces on the left have been proposing this, and there are precedents for it. Canada, for example, imposed an excess profits tax on the banks and insurance companies in 2021, 2022 during the pandemic because they were making huge profits at a time of economic and social emergency. The same argument could apply here. So then you could capture a share of this excess profits and redistribute it, either give it back to consumers through the GST credit or use it to invest in infrastructure. You could use it to support the rollout of renewable energy infrastructure as a way of getting off the fossil fuel roller coaster in the first place. So there's other things that I think we should be thinking about long run as well. Bigger issues like why do we set our prices for energy in Canada, at least for oil products in Canada, based on the world price rather than the actual cost of producing it here in Canada? That's a question that I think we could ask, and there's different ways to do it. We haven't always done it that way in Canada, and we don't have to do it that way. We also have to ask about inflation and anti-inflation policy. The Bank of Canada's one and only hammer in its toolbox is increasing interest rates, no matter what caused the inflation, even if it was caused by something that had nothing to do with Canada, this war in the Persian Gulf. Yet their only response is going to be to jack up interest rates and make us all pay again, not only at the gas pump, but now in higher debt charges. And there are other ways that we could go at trying to manage inflation, I think, that we should be thinking about. But the most immediate and sort of incremental response would be an excess profits tax on the oil industry, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Well, it gives us some choices. It would be nice to have some choices.
Hmm.
Um, we keep hearing a refrain that Canada, we have what the world wants. It's a sort of a pep talk about our resources and our export potential. But you're also trying to make an important additional point. Yeah, people want our resources, but we should want to export them with value added, not just to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, but to export
Hmm.
complete products rather than just unfinished resources. Um, you told a Senate committee, you were at a Senate committee a couple of weeks ago. You talked about this industrial policy that could add more value added producing. Um, that might fall in deaf ears in Ottawa, but if you were a provincial premier and inclined to this kind of line of thinking, what advice might you be able to give to them about how to get this idea in motion?
Hmm. Well, you've touched on a long-standing theme, Tom, in Canadian economic policy, really going back
Yeah.
to Confederation. You know, the whole national policy that John A. Macdonald brought in the 1870s was all about building Canadian value-added industry
Hmm.
as a way of protecting ourselves against annexation by the U.S. Then, we had the wartime planning under C.D. Howe, which was about building our value-added and industrial and technological capacity so we could play a role in the war in World War II, but also so that we'd have stronger industries after, and it worked. That's how we got an aerospace industry in
Mhm.
Canada and the early beginnings of our auto industry. Then we had other sort of strategies through the post-war era to try to develop value-added capacities in Canada, like the Auto Pact, for example, where the government was managing trade and managing investment and managing investment location decisions with an eye to escaping that sort of staples trap, as it's often
Mhm.
called, of
Mhm.
Canada being a supplier of primary resources and nothing else. So we've been addressing this problem, and frankly, we made a lot of progress in the 20th century. By the turn of the century, by 2000, we were no longer a hewer of wood and drawer of water. Most of our exports, 80% of our exports, were value-added manufacturing goods.
Mm.
Now, unfortunately, we've been going backwards big time since then, led by the whole focus on bitumen and oil sands, of course, and the boom in oil production from out west, but other resource sectors as well. So last year, 50% of our exports were value-added manufactured
Mm.
products, down from 80% in the year 2000. So it's been a
Oh.
quarter century of going backwards in structural terms, and kind of back to the future to become this resource supplier. Now, there's all kinds of propaganda from the oil and gas sector, which wants public favors to, make more big investments, saying, this is what Canada can supply the world. This is what they want from us. This is our
Hmm.
solution to Donald Trump. That is to double down on resource exports, especially oil and liquefied natural gas. And I think that is the absolute wrong lesson. At the same time as we do need to diversify our trade away from reliance on the U.S., we also have to diversify what we sell to the world, not just where we sell it,
Yeah.
and make sure that we aren't just digging stuff out of the ground, because there's all kinds of risks to that resource dependence. There's economic risks, there's geopolitical risks, there's environmental risks, of course. So both provincially and federally, it's essential that governments take a look at what value added and high
Yeah.
tech and innovation intensive opportunities are in their parts of Canada, and don't trust the free market to deliver it. That will never work. We need active industrial strategies to build those industries, and provincial governments and the federal government have a role to play. The whole discourse in economics around industrial policy has really changed in the last few years, partly
Mhm.
with the pandemic, and the old idea that governments should just stay out of the way and sign free trade
Hmm.
agreements and let industry decide what we specialize in has
Yeah.
really been debunked and mostly discarded. So I
Hmm.
sense a new openness to the whole principle of industrial policy at the federal level and in most provinces. And I think that even as we're grappling with Donald Trump and this latest oil price shock and so on, we should keep a real focus in Canada on how do we become a fully fledged, diversified, capable industrial economy, not just a supplier of raw materials.
Mm. Mhm.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think we've also, in the past bit, particularly since Trump's tariffs have been impacting policy. So we've gone back to this, attracting investment to Canada to develop our resources. So, my question is, I guess, if the world wants what we own, why do we need to keep providing tax concessions, public subsidies, and other tactics to induce foreign capital in to develop our resources? And so how do Canadians in that thread know if these deals are actually giving us the best price for our resources, or that geostrategically they're being used in ways to strengthen Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the short answer, Nikki, is we don't need to do that. First of all, we don't need foreign capital. Canada's got lots of capital.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's been a whole sort of historic change in Canada's relationship to global capital markets. A decade ago, we switched from being a net relier on incoming foreign investment to being a net supplier of outgoing foreign investment. So Canada, or Canadians and Canadian institutions, including banks and investment funds and so on, now own more capital investment, both the direct foreign investment, but also indirect or portfolio investment. We own more in other countries than other countries own in Canada. So this whole myth that we need foreign investment is wrong. In fact, I'm quite determined that we get some of our own capital back. Starting with pension funds.
Yeah.
Why is the Canada pension plan, of all things, so heavily invested in Trump's U.S., a country that wants to take us over? The Canada pension plan is supposed to be about building Canada, building our society, but also building our economy. And half of its assets are invested in the United States. The same goes for other pension funds, but the same goes for other investors. And the reason they go to America is because America is a really profitable place to do business, thanks to the very, very pro-business and very unequal structures, whether that's tax law or regulatory policy or labor markets, et cetera. So that's why capital flows there. And I'd like to get some of that capital flowing back to Canada, starting with our own capital. Secondly, in terms of what's required to facilitate the development of an export fossil fuel project, whether that's a new oil pipeline or an LNG plant or whatever, we shouldn't be putting a single dollar of public subsidy into that. There's no immediate public value, public interest in trying to make projects like that go ahead if there wasn't a private business case for them. It's not like they're serving Canadians and that we must, put these, grease the wheels, if you like, or provide some incentives. We shouldn't provide a dollar of incentives. Even if there was a fully fledged private business case for an oil pipeline, which there clearly isn't, even then, we'd want to have a hard look at it because of what it means for our economic structure, what it means for our environmental performance, and so on. But we certainly shouldn't feel a compulsion to subsidize it. And yet that's what we're seeing. We're going to see a whole range of outright and disguised subsidies offered for oil pipelines, LNG plants, and so on, just because governments are desperate to make it look like something's happening. In a moment when the economy is challenged by Trump. And I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to go back to fossil fuel exports as our savior, and I think it won't help us in the long run.
We've talked about that a little bit before. We've talked about mining and some heavy subsidies going into mining and really questioning if the subsidies are why are they required if this is such a lucrative business in this mine, then why are we inducing foreign capital with a lot of private money, public money? And we've got Mr. Carney, for example. He's been touring around. He's been talking to people in the Saudi Kingdom, UAE, Singapore about sovereign wealth funds investing in Canada. He's also, though, talked, and I think you've picked up on this and you've made a point about this that's important. He is talking about a sovereign wealth fund of Canada, a Canadian sovereign wealth fund, but there's been some controversy on what exactly he means by that naming and whether it really is what he's saying. And he's talked about it. It's been raised in the context of something called asset cycling and port privatization, airport privatization being part of that asset cycling. Can you just explain how, the good case and maybe the scarier case, the more worrisome case of what this sovereign wealth fund, asset cycling, and our public infrastructure, how does that all what might be an agenda at work here?
Well, the idea of a sovereign wealth fund, I think, is a good idea. And frankly, Canada should have created one years ago. Alberta should have created one years ago.
Yeah.
Instead of using, the fluctuating cream that comes to the government from oil prices when they're high to finance little silly giveaways. The latest one being Daniel Smith giving $100 to each Albertan. What a joke that is. Instead of doing that kind of stuff, or not having a sales tax or other things, they should have put money aside from non-renewable resource rents and used it as a tool for active industrial development.
Yeah,
and Canada should do the same thing too. The principle of a sovereign wealth fund is it's an investment platform that is used for public interest goals. It's not just a place to park money or play the markets. It should be used actively as a tool of economic and industrial development. A good example, everyone talks about the Norway Fund, which is a big one and mostly based on oil. I think a better example for Canada is the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund. There's one called Temasek, which basically holds a portfolio of minority equity positions in all kinds of strategic industries that have invested in Singapore. And it's used actively to try and develop value-added industries, high-tech industries, tech-related industries in Singapore to support that small country's capacities. And Singapore is a very, very flexible, very innovative, very forward-looking place. And this sovereign wealth fund has been, an important part of that story. So in general, I like the idea of public investment and public investment in various channels, whether it was a straight up public investment bank or a sovereign wealth fund, or even using public pension money for development purposes. The Quebec pension plan does that to some extent. But I have no idea where Mark Carney is going with his idea. And he's been vague, deliberately vague. They're going to have a consultation process to find out what Canadians think about it and how it should be structured. But some of what he said, including this reference to asset recycling, he called it, makes me think this is not what a sovereign wealth fund should be.
Right.
The asset recycling idea is to take public assets, publicly owned assets right now, sell them, and then use the money to invest in something else. And it's not a way to build public wealth over time. It's a way to use a public vehicle to sort of facilitate different transactions. So, first of all, there's a direct risk from privatizing those things. He's talked about ports and airports, but there's other public assets that could be on the sales block if that model goes ahead. So consumers are going to pay more because of it. The public interest is going to be undermined. We'll see even national security issues if we get, foreign companies or foreign governments owning our ports and airports. That's not a good thing in this world. But then what the money is used for, I'm worried it's going to be used to just facilitate or disguise subsidy to some of these other private projects, including pipelines that can't stand on their own 2 feet as a business case. Okay, in comes our sovereign wealth fund to, take a big equity chunk or guarantee loans or de-risk the whole project to help it go ahead. So given the other directions of Carney's policy, I'm worried the sovereign wealth fund would be more like a publicly owned private equity fund, that jumps into different things, facilitates changes, and then gets out, to maybe make a quick buck, but maybe not.
And in that scenario, the public assets like ports or maybe highways or airports or whatever public assets kind of get thrown into the fund, become liquid, used for something else. That they get turned into an investment that gets mobilized for a mine, for a pipeline. Is that what you're thinking?
That's how it could happen. So I spent some time in Australia, as Nikki mentioned at the beginning, and for a while they were big time into this asset recycling model. Right. And they sold off a bunch of their airports, a bunch of their ports, with controversy. The Chinese state-owned companies own a couple of Australia's ports, for example.
That's what you want.
Which has issues. And then it meant that consumers had to pay for everything, private airports, private toll roads, which are all over the place in Australia. And in theory, the government was supposed to use this money to finance other public infrastructure projects without just normally borrowing money like governments normally do for long-term public investment. So the whole rationale for it was dubious, and it was very much used as a tool of privatization. There's been a lot of rethinking in Australia more recently about this model, and I think they're going to move away from it. So it would be unfortunate if Canada went down that road, just as the Australians are realizing it's not the best way to do public investment.
They can't come back from it. Yeah, I mean, let's stick to this financing issue for a bit, because there has been a fair bit of controversy about using finance P3s for infrastructure over the years. We're still doing that, and now there's this new Defense Security Resilience Bank that's going to be offering P3s for major defense purchases. So, what are your thoughts on using the value of using private equity or private credit versus public credit in these ways?
Well, when it's a core public service or a core public infrastructure, it's wrong to privatize it. And P3s, again, are another kind of stealth strategy for privatization. The public still pays for it. This is the thing. It isn't true, marketization. The public is still paying the freight. But there's now private equity interests involved trying to cream some of the surplus off of it. And they always claim that the private developer or the private operator will do things more efficiently or with less risk, and that's what saves the public money. And in practice, it doesn't turn out that way. There's, whole catalogs of case studies of P3s that have gone wrong, from the schools in Nova Scotia, which were a scandal, to the bridge in Winnipeg, to even some of the things that we've done here in BC, like the Sea to Sky Highway construction.
Yeah.
Tons of examples of P3s that cost the government. The government still bears the cost. The government bears the risk. But the private operator, private investor creams off some surplus, and it's not necessary. Governments borrow money regularly, and they should borrow money for public investment. They get lower interest rates on their borrowing than any private investor can get to access capital. And there's no evidence that the private sector automatically does it better. So on any of those core private, core public services and public infrastructure, it should be owned and operated and by the government, and the government should be accountable for making sure that the service is delivered effectively. Now, this defense production thing is a bit different. It's more around procurement, I think, of different types of military supplies, ships, submarines, other types of hardware.
Systems,
and different systems. So, those are areas that are not core public delivery, although there's obviously a public interest in making sure that it's done well and done effectively, and that Canada gets some of the economic benefits from it. So it will be interesting. I mean, I lament the fact that military spending is this big growing category of our budget in the first place. On the other hand, as an economist, if we're going to spend the money on the military, we'd better make sure we're getting full economic benefits in Canada from it. And, some of the negotiations, say with the Swedes on the aircraft or the Koreans on the submarines, have huge promise to, inject new investment in a range of different sectors in Canada. And this defense industrial strategy that the federal government has announced, I think, has got some good potential to try and maximize the industrial benefits from those big purchases. Lamentable as it is that we're spending so much on the military.
Just splitting those two pieces apart. So on one side we got the defense the expenditure from the public sector to buy new submarines, buy new weapon systems, all those kind of expenditures. But now we're talking about a finance pool, and Jim, it seems that RBC, I think, seems to be the Royal Bank of Canada seems to be the prime mover behind this thing, which was proposed at the G7 by Mark Carney. And it seems to me that if you're going to go buy a submarine from contractor X, and you need the cash to do that today, the choice is we're going to go to some bank which is backed by the RBC to get that money, or we're going to just do what government usually does, which is float bonds. And I'm having difficulty understanding wouldn't the private always be more expensive? Can't the public sector always borrow more cheaply?
Oh, absolutely. It can. Interest rates, particularly for the federal government, are the lowest interest rates of any source of borrowing in Canada's economy. There's no reason why the government has to turn to some kind of complicated private or semi-private financial mechanism to afford this. And I'm not sure
Yeah.
that's what this National
I'm
Defense Bank is for. It's
I'm
kind of
not
like
sure either, Jim,
the
to be honest.
sovereign. It's kind of like the
Yeah.
sovereign wealth fund that Carney floated. Like, he comes from the investment banking world. He loves that world, and he's clearly trying to impart that way of thinking in
Mhm.
major federal economic decisions. So the federal government does not need to go to a bank to raise the money to buy the submarines. Not at all.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pivot to something a little more tactile. Auto assembly. You spent a lot of years studying this, so really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Ontario has, I think, 10 by my count, auto assembly plants. They play a huge role in this province's economy. Trump's tariffs have absolutely have targeted especially the assembly side, uh, and it was a sector that was already having some difficulty. The Oakville plant. The Brampton plant, haven't turned out a car for a couple of years now. There's an Ingersoll plant at GM Cami. It's kind of touch and go. It's been reduced. There was a plan for a new Honda plant. That's now gone. That's EV strategy is poof, disappeared with the election of Mr. Trump. So there's a lot in process here. Our struggling sector, renegotiation of CUSMA and the tariffs, and now Unifor is just starting bargaining with the Detroit Three, actually the day that we release this episode. So thinking about all these moving pieces, is it possible, if you were the Ontario Premier or if you were the Prime Minister of Canada, is it possible to have a strategy when there's that many moving pieces in play? Or conversely, does that make it absolutely essential to have a strategy? Tell us what your thoughts are about that kind of contrast, short term and long term as well.
Yeah, your second take on that, Tom, is the correct one. This is exactly when we need a strong, focused, flexible, well-resourced auto strategy, and both the federal and the Ontario governments have to play a big role in it. So Trump's tariffs, of course, are an existential threat. About 90% of what we produce in Canada is exported to the United States, and that has been true for 60 years, since the Auto Pact came in 1965. The Auto Pact was a free trade agreement of sorts. It meant that companies that participated in the Auto Pact could ship vehicles and parts back and forth across the border without tariffs. But it came with conditions, and the condition was that the companies had to maintain a manufacturing footprint in Canada that was broadly proportional to the amount of value added they sold in Canada. So if you sell here, you produce here. That was the philosophy, and it was a great one, and it worked. Then we shifted to free trade agreements in North America that undermined most of the value of the Auto Pact. And then we went down the route with the World Trade Organization, which quickly ruled the Auto Pact out of bounds, period. So since the turn of the century, we've been operating without a safety net. And the industry and governments, I think, have done a good job grappling with all of the challenges, the cost competition from Mexico, the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Really almost was a death blow to General Motors and Chrysler, but we worked our way through that. Trump's tariffs, 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican-made vehicles, you can't overcome that.
Pretty tough.
And he said explicitly he wants all auto assembly to go to the United States. He's got no right to say that. They're not bringing jobs back to America. That's nonsense. Canada has been producing cars as long as America has. Those are our jobs, not America's jobs.
Right.
But Trump is going after them. So the impact has been severe. We've seen a significant layoffs in different locations, a big decline in auto production and auto exports for obvious reasons. Now, of the plants that you mentioned, Tom, one of them is actually a good news story. You mentioned Fort Oakville.
Yeah.
And they've gone through some changes, but they're gearing up right now for a huge launch of large pickup trucks.
Okay.
So in a way, it's the antithesis of the sort of the focus on electric vehicles
Yeah.
Yes.
that was there a few years ago. But the point is,
Right.
people still need these trucks and still buy
Yeah.
them. So it's
Okay.
a very important investment in Canada. And it's also a sign that Ford is committed to its Canadian operations despite Trump's tariffs, unlike some of the other companies which have quickly stepped back from some of their Canadian plans. So that is, I think, one of the reasons why Unifor chose Ford to be the first company to negotiate with, and they're starting that today. And so, that'll be really important for the union and the company to show that you can still make things happen, even with
Yeah.
Donald Trump. Their focus will be on stability and making sure the Canadian launch goes very well. Ford also has big engine manufacturing operations in Windsor that are also launching new products. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic. This could be, a positive step, but it doesn't solve the elephant in the room, which is Donald Trump's tariffs. And the Kuzma renegotiation, is kind of a lot of drama. There's supposedly a July 1st deadline, but it's not a deadline. And nothing is going to happen by July 1st. I guess little is going to happen this year. But the downside of that is for the industries that have been targeted by Trump with his sectoral tariffs, including auto, steel,
Yeah.
aluminum,
Yep.
forestry, possibly others down the road, we're not going to get any quick relief. What we're going to have to do is help these industries stay viable for the next year or two until either Trump loses the midterms so much that he has to back off some of his ridiculous policies, or eventually Trump's out of office and hopefully U.S. policy becomes sane again.
Yeah.
U.S. business knows that it needs North American trade. In aggregate terms, America gets as much benefit from that trade as Canada and Mexico do. There's no doubt about it. And American business knows that, and American business is telling their government that. So at the end of the day, I expect Kuzma to continue in more or less the same form. But those sectoral tariffs are going to have to come off, or else the auto industry and others are going to be in real trouble.
Well, Jim, I think we had endless questions for you after we're heading into our 6 months. A lot of these issues have been coming up a lot on the show. But we thank you for joining us today and shedding so much light into some of these challenges and opportunity facing our country right now. And of course, facing people in their pocketbooks and their families that maybe we aren't getting to the depth of the issue on. How can folks follow the work that you're doing?
Oh, well, our think tank, the Center for Future Work, has got a good website, centerforfuturework.ca. And all of our research is open access there. There's also a mailing list you can sign up for, or follow us on all the social media platforms.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break and be back with Love It or Heave It.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Before we wrap up, we've come to the part of the show we'd like to call Love It or Heave It, about something you love and want to keep, or something you'd like to heave and forever forget. What do you got for this week, Nikki?
Well, this is definitely in the concerning category, probably definitely in the hate category for any dog lovers. But the news broke in the past few days that a BC-based mineral exploration company has hired Trump's former Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, to a strategic advisory role.
That's the dog reference.
Yes.
What? Did she shoot her dog or something stupid?
Yes.
Was that the story?
Yes.
God, what a weirdo.
Something along those lines we don't like to talk about. So so she's joined this company, it's BC-based company, to do strategic advisory, supporting their mission, which is acquiring and advancing critical mineral exploration opportunities through an artificial intelligence enhanced technology platform. So I'm not sure that that's, something that Kristi Noem's got lots of background in from her governor role, from her role, of course, with ICE, which has been quite controversial before she departed from that role, or was departed by the president. And she still does have this mysterious role with this special envoy for the Shield of Americas, which is an entity that Trump established as well. And she's the first one of that new, really related to activity and coordination across Latin America around cartels. So again, interesting activity for her, now switching into something that I think is bringing the concern, particularly for British Columbians, because there is this insight here about using critical minerals that are being prioritized, that are being mined here in the province. This company has a few sites already for mining in the province in mind,
Mm-hmm.
and then bringing someone in who's so tied into Trump and his ambitions into the realm of advisory here. So getting a little bit of chatter, I think, about, people both being, sort of the question of where's the fit here for us. But I think also that concern about the fact, because
Yeah.
most of BC's mining products do get shipped overseas, can't trace what's being mined here. When they're going into defense, when this company is looking at sort of the AI focused technology and defense contracts, they do have some patents pending with the American government as well. And of course, we're always grappling with, as a country right now, this U.S. interest in making us the 51st state. And now we have this both interest and threat from the states and Canadian resources, which is a constant in our lives now. And then Nome joining a company here as an advisor. So I think as it rolls out, lots to
Yeah.
unpack with it and see what the implications are. But I think definitely, and I don't think just limited to BC, concern about what the role is of someone like Nome with critical minerals
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
with exports.
What's going on there? I was just thinking, we in a couple of weeks we're going to sit down with Sabrina Fernandez, who's
Yeah.
a Brazilian
Yeah.
political commentary, political commentator, and because they've got big elections coming up in Brazil.
Yeah.
Brazil is a big country with a lot of resources, similar to Canada in many ways. And I wonder if she would have some insight on, this, how the search for critical minerals, how the shield of America, how that this kind of renewed Monroe Doctrine that all the resources of the Americas are U.S. resources, how that's all shaken out in their elections and
Yeah.
how they're coping with it.
Yeah.
Oh my
Interesting.
gosh! Anyway, I'm looking forward to that. That'll be interesting. I've never been to Brazil. Have you
I have
ever been to?
not. I have
No.
not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Me
Not
neither.
yet, we'll
Um,
say. Maybe we'll need a little
yes,
podcast trip. Okay. Okay, Tom, what
that's
about
great. That's
you?
a
What
great
else
idea.
is
If the Westons sponsor us,
Yeah, we'll
we
head
will
down to
go.
Brazil for a live show, just like
Yeah,
convention.
exactly.
Just like
That's
Winnipeg.
right.
Here we
Winnipeg.
are.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Tom, what's on your mind this week?
Well, I am loving the heavy doses of copium the National Post is trying to inject into the public debate about the Conservatives' sagging public support in the polls. We've seen at least one poll now showing the Polyev Conservatives under 30%. So the National Post dutifully is changing how support gets measured. In short, down is the new up. So, according to Simon Tuck at the National Post, the Conservatives are actually getting, as he says, quote, a boost in the polls because the gap in public support between the Liberals and Conservatives has shrunk a little bit over the last couple of months. Now, I just feel obliged to tell Mr. Tuck that that's not how boosts work. A boost is when something goes up. It's definitely not when something goes down, even if that down is going less fast than something else also going down. Yeah, sure, like Liberal popularity appears to have crested. I'd suggest it's a combination of some dubious right-wing things being done by Mark Carney and some good moves by Avi Lewis, has got some people shifting from Liberal to NDP. But that doesn't change up and down. Here's the thing, up remains up and down continues to be down. On the left, we're always trying to create power by bringing people together. And, it seems to me that truth and facts are an important part of our value set because they provide a way that we can reach common understandings and then move ahead. But on the right, increasingly, it seems like facts and truth not important. What's important is myth, and just continue to spin, and repeat like as if you're in some, cult. But at some times, like in this case, when apparently we're supposed to believe that the Conservatives are going up because the Liberals came down a little bit faster, that somehow that's a boost for the Conservatives. I mean, it's just so kind of comically funny. It's sad, and I find that actually kind of amusing. So I love it.
Yes, you're making love. Okay. Well, and interesting, I think while we're recording, Pierre Poilievre's actually back here in BC on that myth and faux outreach machine doing an announcement around private property rights in context of Indigenous rights. So,
He's in favor.
yeah, and so, that's continuing to really shift the public discourse into what they're concerned about, what's real and what's not, and as really an attempt at, to get them up in the polls. So there we are.
Yep. A lot of distortion. Let's just keep the distortion machine running.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's some loves and hates. Nikki is like a potential heave, I think, if I'm hearing you right.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
You're
I hate
like,
it.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Anyway, you've heard from Nikki and me now, so you can email us at lefteastwest@gmail.com if you want to tell us about what you're loving or heaving. And you can tap the follow button on your podcast player to get reminders of our upcoming interviews with Ontario NDP leader Mark Stiles, with Carla Beck, and the leader of Saskatchewan NDP, and Jared Walker, the executive director of the Canadians for Tax Fairness, all in the next few weeks. So looking forward to that. Thanks for joining. And Nikki, see you later. Have a nice week.
Yeah, you too, Tom.
Okay, take care.
Thanks for joining Left, East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left, East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left, East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left, East to West. We'll see you next week.